Well, I think it's important to try to begin by understanding what exactly is happening in Ukraine, because I think a good deal of confusion has arisen. I've been to Ukraine many times. I've visited the country almost every year for the last 10 years. And it's been obvious to me for some time that Ukraine was in a very vulnerable position for two reasons. Firstly, President Vladimir Putin clearly did not accept Ukraine's move westwards, not only with the discussion of potential NATO membership, but also the discussion of European Union membership. In his eyes, Ukraine was a historic part of the Russian Empire, and he consistently questioned the legitimacy of a Ukraine that effectively decoupled from Russia and became integrated into the West. That was why in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and sent forces into eastern Ukraine to help separatists establish control of Donetsk and Luhansk. It was in response to a political crisis in Ukraine when the then president Yanukovych turned away from the possibility of European negotiations and triggered a revolution, which in turn led to the Russian intervention. So this story goes back years. Not just to 2014, but even further back to 2008, when the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine was first discussed. At the same time, I think it's clear that the West offered Ukraine the worst of both worlds. It offered the possibility of NATO membership, which clearly was regarded by Russia as unacceptable, but it didn't deliver on that promise. So Ukraine had the prospect of NATO membership, but never. And that was really, I thought, the worst possible combination. And I agreed with Henry Kissinger when he argued in 2014 that it would be better to take NATO membership off the table and construct an alternative security arrangement for Ukraine on the basis of neutrality. Ultimately, I think the West failed to provide sufficient support for Ukraine in recent years to deter Russia from an invasion. There were significant arms shipments to Ukraine, but they fell away after 2018. And it seems to me that one of the lessons here is that if you're not capable of making a country like Ukraine well enough armed to deter an invasion, then an invasion is quite likely to happen. I think now the West, led by the United States, has committed itself to preventing Ukraine from losing the war, but it's not clear to me what exactly that looks like. We have now entered a new phase of the war. Russia failed to capture the capital, Kyiv, and is now engaged in a war of attrition in the Donbas region. But from where I'm sitting, it looks as if Russia is winning that war, partly because of the very heavy casualties that Ukraine is suffering in this artillery war of attrition. So I think there's a very urgent need to think of ways to end this conflict before Ukraine is permanently and seriously damaged as an economy. I don't think it can be in the interests of the Ukrainian people for this war to go on interminably. And unfortunately, there's every sign, at least from where I'm sitting, that the war can drag on through the summer and even into the autumn and winter, at which point Russia's leverage over the European countries grows because the full cost of sanctions, the full cost of cutting off Russian gas and oil from Europe will become apparent when winter comes. The last thing I want to focus on, though, is the role of China in this crisis, which I think is crucial in two ways. First, let me be clear. I can't believe that President Putin would have gone ahead without at least tacit, if not explicit, approval from the Chinese leadership. And this is an extremely unfortunate aspect of the crisis. The second point is that in response, the Biden administration seems to see the war in Ukraine primarily in terms of its relationship with China. There are clearly people in Washington who see their support for Ukraine as a signal to Beijing, see Ukraine in effect as a proxy in what I've called Cold War II. And the goal of US policy, in the eyes of at least some members of the administration, is to deter China from taking military action with respect to Taiwan. In my view, the strategy is a dangerous one in two ways. First of all, it's not clear to me that it works. Extending the war causes all kinds of disruption, including creating an inflation problem for the world. I don't think it really has a significant impact on the way the Chinese government thinks about the Taiwan question. Secondly, I think it's extremely dangerous for the United States and China to go down a collision course over the question of Taiwan. If this is Cold War II, which I believe it is, with China, as it were, taking the place of the Soviet Union, then the Ukraine war is equivalent to the Korean War in 1950. And the next stage in Cold War II would be an equivalent to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, in 1962, the world came extremely close to World War III over an island. And I think we would be running a very similar risk if there were a US-China confrontation over the island of Taiwan. So my argument is, let's learn a lesson from the first Cold War. And the lesson is that détente is better than confrontation. And I would argue that it would be preferable to fast forward and avoid the Cuban Missile Crisis in our time and go straight to détente, accelerate the Cold War cycle, as it were, and get more quickly to a period when the two superpowers focus on reducing tension, slowing down the arms race, and avoiding the kind of confrontation that would carry with it the risk of World War III. Apologies, Henry, that was a very long answer, but this is an extremely important point in my mind. And it's one that I'm trying my best to communicate, not only to people in Washington, but also, I hope, to people in Beijing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your analysis. I think you have given a very clear your perspective about how this Ukraine will come along, which I think there's a lot of valuable lessons to be learned. And also, you analyze the current situation of what's the danger of that maybe leading to a Cold War. I have one disagreement is that I'm not sure that the Chinese leadership would probably know this beforehand, because at that time when President Biden and President Xi had a virtual summit, we had all the good words from President Biden, but the moment he went back, he said he would boycott the Beijing Olympic. And then suddenly Russian comes out, Putin said, okay, I'm coming, I'm going to support big way, and I'll be the major power to attend Beijing Olympics. So I think there's something reciprocal that China always have all kind of statement, friendship, memorandum, and so I don't think we were really aware, because Chinese, China was the last to pull out its Patriot from Kyiv. We're almost getting some people killed there. If they knew there was a serious attack like that, they would probably put them out the earliest. But other than that, I think your argument also make a lot of sense. That this actually is a Cold War coming up, and even though Russia is involved, there could be more target by the U.S. like what we see from recent U.S. administration. Also, Secretary Blinken's speech lately that they have to invest, they have to alliance, and then they have to compete with China. So you see that kind of a framework that they are building right now. But you are right. You talk about detente. That's really a great word. I mean, we should really revisit the wisdom of that. By President Reagan, who does that with Gorbachev, and now I think Biden probably in a very I mean, we don't see many times. There's a midterm election coming up. Democrats probably is facing a huge challenge, may lose both majorities, and also that this China tariff has contributed significantly to the the U.S. inflation. According to some think tank, it could be probably cost 2 to 3%. So this trade war doesn't really make sense. And you are right. Taiwan is really a hot spot probably if we're not careful. And as you said, the Cuba Missile Crisis almost led us to the Third World War. So those historical lessons, you as a great historian, has reminded the people from East and West of all those dangerous outcome. And actually, you are the autobiographer of Dr. Henry Kissinger, and he has said we are at the foothills of the Cold War. So how do you think we can really get out of this dangerous situation, or maybe a Cold War 2.0? And where do you see the China, U.S. and EU to some extent that we can really safeguard multilateral system, find a way to peacefully coexist? Of course, we have differences. We have values differences. We have a different running governance system. But let's not really get into a conflict. I saw recently Chinese defense minister answered 11 questions at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and also he met 6 counterparts in different countries. So we see some high-level dialogue now, and Chinese top diplomat Yang Jiechi also meet Jack Sullivan lately. So what do you see how China U.S. can really getting out of this very dangerous trend that as you are so familiar with the both situation, and also sitting in the UK to look at both sides?
Well, I think that the lesson of history is that, and this was an argument my old friend Graham Allison made several years ago, is that a rising power and an established power are quite likely to come into conflict. This is one of the patterns of history. And the interesting thing about the relationship between the US and China is that it went through a period of being relatively harmonious and cooperative, the era of what I called Chimerica. But then quite quickly, Chimerica, the partnership between the US and China, which was mainly economic in its nature, began to crumble and was replaced by something that looked and sounded a lot like a Cold War. Now, when I first made this argument in 2018, not everyone agreed, but this was partly because they'd forgotten the true nature of the first Cold War. The true nature of a Cold War, as George Orwell said in 1945, is that it is a peace that is no peace. There isn't an outright world war, but the two superpowers engage in all kinds of indirect conflict. The arms race was the most obvious example of the first Cold War, the nuclear arms race, but there was also a space race. A Cold War is a technological competition, but it's also an ideological competition. And then it has, in addition, classic territorial aspects where the two superpowers seek to have spheres of influence or reach far abroad in search of support. So if one compares Cold War I with our present situation, the truth is that we now have most of the characteristics of a Cold War. And I think it's important for both sides to recognize this. Part of what made the first Cold War dangerous was that there was no precedent. And I don't think people fully understood the risks that were being run in the early phase of the Cold War. The Korean War was a very risky moment. There were serious debates about whether nuclear weapons should be used against China by the United States. In the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a Soviet submarine came very close indeed to firing a nuclear torpedo at American naval vessels, which really would have triggered a world war. So the lesson of history is, when you're in a Cold War, it's good to recognize that and not be in denial about it. And it's also good to recognize that Cold War is better than World War III. The most important thing is to manage the relationship, manage the technological competition, manage the ideological competition, to avoid escalation to outright world war. That's the critical lesson, I think, of the First Cold War. And if you ask how that was done, then I think you have to give some credit, indeed quite a lot of credit, to Henry Kissinger and the presidents that he served, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, who did a great deal to relax relations with the Soviet Union, and of course, began that process of building a diplomatic relationship between the United States and China, beginning with Kissinger's secret trip to Beijing in 1971 and Richard Nixon's visit to China 50 years ago. Now, from my vantage point, I would far rather that we tried to revive some of that spirit of détente, the term that was used in the 1970s, because it seems to me that the alternative is an increasingly competitive, combative, and ultimately conflict-oriented relationship, which will have more than one flashpoint. It's not just about Taiwan, it's also about the South China Sea. Listening to Antony Blinken's recent speech, almost every issue was mentioned in that speech, including Hong Kong and Xinjiang. The administration seems to be on a collision course. And unfortunately, one hears somewhat similar rhetoric from the Chinese side. My message to both sides is you really do not want to replay the Cuban Missile Crisis over Taiwan. Nobody would benefit from such a risky escalation. Far more important, I think, at this point, to seek a new era of détente and to revive the kind of communications, the kind of strategic dialogue that the US and China used to have. Let me add one more point. It's come as a great surprise to many people, including, I think, in China, that Joe Biden's administration has in some ways been more combative towards China than President Donald Trump's. Trump was interested in a trade war. He wasn't really interested in any other kind of war. And my sense is that if he'd been re-elected, we would probably have seen negotiations about the tariffs by now. Ironically, Joe Biden ran against Trump, partly arguing that he would be tougher on China than Trump. And he's followed through since being inaugurated by pursuing a policy that I think authentically is tougher. Why the Democratic Party wants to persist with Donald Trump's tariffs has never been clear to me, because they opposed them at the time that they were being imposed. So there's something a little odd here about the way in which the US administration is proceeding. And considering the inflation problem that the Biden administration faces, it would seem to me perfectly obvious that a smart step in the right direction would be to start discussing how to reduce the tariffs and bring to an end a trade war that, it must be said, did not achieve terribly much, even in its own terms.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. Actually, so you gave a very good analysis about this Cold War danger that we've been seeing more and more now. And you're right. I mean, many people in China felt that when President Biden comes up, and maybe we should have a little relax, since he's an old friend of President Xi, and the time, the many meals and meetings they had together. He understands China, and also all the previous visits he's been quite a number of times. But at the end, it seems that was not the case. I mean, he's even more systematically containing China, and also encroach China and encircle China and things like that. So that really made people wondering what's going on. And you mentioned about this history, historical lessons. I mean, we probably really should visit the wisdom of Dr. Kissinger, there's President Nixon. You're right. This is the 50 years anniversary of Nixon visit to China, and we just recently had another televised event about Kissinger's 99th birthday with Chinese and also American top diplomats and think tankers. So I think that can we have some realistic view? Because I think China and the US, being the number one and number two largest economy in the world, has a moral responsibility. I've been discussing with Graham Allison a few times on similar dialogue, and Joseph Nye, and you know, many of Larry Summers. I mean, they all felt we shouldn't have a cold one. Nobody wants decoupling. You know, they were saying, you know, yeah, we have a, you know, competition. We have also cooperation. That's competition, or cooperative rivalry. Use Graham's word. So can we, you know, China, US, can we really get into that kind of situation? Because you mentioned about Chemical a few years ago, that was a, you know, very popular name. You know, 300 million migrant workers married with 300 million consumers in the US. Let's, you know, put this, you know, intertwined, you know, ecosystem that really seems to, you know, carry it on forever. But then, unfortunately, things starting to change. So how can we really get back? Because the world is really facing all the difficulties, dangers. We're probably going to have a famine with all the food prices going up. And China's energy is 70% dependent on the import. I mean, with this oil price at all-time high. So we really want to see China and US get along, manageable. You know, admit their differences. There's some problems. Let's face it. You know, but we shouldn't go to the extreme of really I'm going to contain everywhere, or I'm going to you know, drive up the military budget of all the countries in the region and everywhere. So that's really concerning, because given how dangerous, how vulnerable the world we are facing now, we can't afford the US and China not to work together. You are the historian, you know China, US so well. You know, need to subscribe something for us. I'd like to hear from you as well.